Hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation series for Mindful Techie Tuesdays. I'm excited to be here with a very special guest as we are in the midst, as you know, the largest homeschooling and working from home experiment in history. And many of us, particularly in the US, are in the midst of preparing for back to school season if school hasn't already started. And then it also means back to work as well for parents, right? Parents are going back to work as whatever the traditional roles are in the workforce, but then also as teachers' aides as well, right, and educators. So I'm excited to be able to have Teodora Pavkovic join us today. She is a psychologist and parenting coach, and she is also well versed in what's happening in the world when it comes to technology and all things digital. And so I'm excited to be able to have her join us for a conversation about what it means to be a parent in the current environment. And more broadly, how do we actually, for our children and for ourselves, how do we enhance our emotional and social well-being in the current environment? So, Teodora, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Miko. I'm so glad to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk about these really, really important topics, probably more important now than they've ever been.
Awesome. Well, so let's just go ahead and dive in. And as we dive in, I'm curious because there's so much going on in the world right now. Let me just ask you, how are you as an individual managing right now in the current time?
Well, thank you for asking that question. First of all, I really appreciate that. I don't think we kind of take enough time to ask each other that question. It's really simple, but I feel like it's a really profound one of how you're doing. And I think overall, for the most part, I'm doing quite well. I'm very lucky in that my family is doing really well. I'm doing really well in terms of my just kind of physical health and well-being in that sense. So I think for the most part, when it comes to those kind of very basic needs, they're definitely met and I'm all right. When it comes to the last kind of 6 months in terms of my own kind of emotional, psychological well-being, looking at the world, wondering what's going to happen with it, looking again at my family, kind of worrying about their well-being. It's been a roller coaster, and that's kind of the image that I find for me to be the most appropriate. So even though kind of overall I have this awareness of the fact that I'm doing okay in that most basic sense, it's definitely been very difficult, and I have found it to kind of vary on a weekly basis. So there's some weeks during which I'm able to kind of tap into that gratitude a lot more strongly. And then there are other weeks in which my kind of, my worried brain gets away with things, and I spend a lot of time worrying and in this kind of state of fear and somewhat kind of catastrophic predictions, I guess, or expectations of what the world is going to look like when it comes to so many different things, when it comes to our general health, when it comes to how we socialize with each other, when it comes to kids growing up in this world, when it comes to this whole question of, are we going to go back to normal and what's that going to look like? In my particular case, I'm lucky in that my husband is physically present here with me, but both of our families are kind of scattered across the globe. And so in that sense, our thoughts and our worries are very scattered as well, because we're thinking about all these different family members who are living in different countries where, political situations are different, social situations are different, the healthcare systems are different. There's just a lot of, there are many variables present, which of course just only makes us even more worried. So that's somewhat of a maybe kind of winding answer. I think overall I'm doing all right and I'm okay, but those fears and those worries definitely come in, and they touch upon, I think, every aspect of life. So whether it's health, relationships, social, emotional well-being, my work, the work of, again, my family members and friends. I have some friends who were sick with COVID, and so so just a lot of worries, I guess, going on, and the main task at hand is to try to kind of battle them and keep them at bay, and like I said, to kind of tap into that gratitude as much as possible.
Yes, and I appreciate you sharing that and your vulnerability. Yeah. As we mentioned at the top of the conversation, that you're a psychologist, and so the fact that you're sharing this, number one, it just validates that we're all a part of the same human experience, this roller coaster that we're all on collectively in terms of the emotions and the way that we might be responding to what's happening. So I want to just offer gratitude for that. But then also pinpoint something that you shared in terms of the two things. One is, despite all of those things that are happening, you're like, we're here having this conversation now. So you're finding a way to move forward. And you mentioned gratitude as one of the ways that you're doing that. So before we move forward, I was curious, can you maybe say a little bit more about the gratitude piece and how that's helping you to move forward?
Sure. So part of the kind of the training that I've received, and then the focus in my work when I work with clients, is positive psychology and positive psychology practices together with principles of emotional intelligence as well. And so, of course, for anyone who's familiar with any aspect of positive psychology, those positive emotional states play a really huge role there, and they've been researched for several decades at this point. And so these positive emotional states are states like gratitude, like compassion, self-compassion in particular, states of awe, states of kindness, forgiveness as well. And these are just some of the examples. There are more, of course. And so one of my kind of goals throughout, maybe not everyday life, but definitely on a weekly basis, is to try and tap into those different positive emotional states as much as possible, to try to kind of balance out a lot of the negativity that we're kind of wired to be on the lookout for anyway. As human beings, our brains are built that way. But we're in the midst of a global pandemic, which, with the exception of a few very, very old members of our global society, none of us have been through before. We don't know what this is like. There's no kind of user's guide to how to handle this. And so it's this attempt to try and balance things out. And one of the best ways that I know how to do that is to tap into things like gratitude and like self-compassion, and kindness. And awe is a really big one as well that I like to talk about a lot, because I don't think we spend enough time talking about it. And so some wonderful research has been done on that at the University of California at Berkeley, where they've looked into what are the ways in which we can tap into awe. So some of the ways are being closer to nature. Some of them are through worship. So for those of us who have kind of religious and spiritual practices. And then another one is art, which is a really big one for me. So I try to, even though I can't kind of physically, I try to expose myself to art as much as I can virtually. And then the gratitude piece is just really to be, in positive psychology, we call it a detective for good. And it's something that we teach very young kids as well. So just kind of looking around our inner and outer landscape and really intentionally looking for the good things, looking for the positive things, looking for the things that we have that nurture us and that support us and that feed us and that give us joy, that make us laugh, that make us feel loved, that make us feel like we belong, like we're accepted. All of those things that kind of our brain finds yummy. I like to use that very non-scientific term for that. But the things that our brain really likes to marinate in, I try to seek out those things in an active way as much as I possibly can. And then also to help other people do it as well. So like I mentioned at the beginning, physically and in terms of my health, I'm doing fine. And that's a really big deal right now, given what's going on in the world. So for me and for any of our viewers who are in that state, I always recommend that to kind of be the starting point, to tap into that physical presence and say, right now, in this moment, at this point in time, I'm all right. I'm safe and I'm healthy, and then we can kind of move on from there.
Yes, and I think that's so beautiful what you shared, and there's so much to unpack there. And the one thing I want to highlight is, what I'm hearing from you, Alex, because maybe I'm going to put my frame on this, is that in life, we experience constant change and disruption, right? That's part of life. That's part of the human experience. And, what we are experiencing with the pandemic might be unprecedented on some level, but it still represents part of the constant change and disruption that we experience in life. And we always have a choice, no matter where we are, no matter what we're experiencing, in terms of how we respond. And what I loved about what you just shared is that you gave us a whole range of ways that we can do that. Now, obviously, there are reasons that folks like you exist to help people build up their capacity and their resilience to be able to do that in their low moments. But nonetheless, it points to the options that we have, even when things on the outside might appear to be dark or at their lowest level. So I do want to move us forward and talk about some of the other things that we have on the slate. But do you have any? Do you want to respond to that, or you want to say anything more about that?
So I was just going to say, kind of as you were talking about that, the one idea that came to mind is the fact that we're constantly trying to balance out chaos and rigidity in our lives, and that comes from the wonderful work of Dr. Daniel Siegel, who has written a lot about this, who teaches a lot about this, who's kind of taken on the task of trying to define and describe what the mind is. And one of the ways in which he talks about this and our kind of existence in this world, and one of the biggest tasks that we have is to really try and find that balance, because too much chaos isn't great, as we're seeing right now, and especially as we're seeing here in the United States. On the other hand, being incredibly rigid is also really, really unhelpful to us as human beings. And in fact, the species that have survived have been the ones that have been the most adaptable. So it's not necessarily the fittest and the strongest, but it's the ones that are most able to adapt. And so I think moments such as these are really calling on us to try and do that, to try and make sure that we're not kind of staying stuck in our ways, stuck in our beliefs. One of the topics that I often teach on as well is how to challenge our negative thinking, how to challenge some of our belief patterns that we've picked up kind of as we've grown up ever since early childhood, and to see not necessarily if we can kind of convert them into more positive versions of themselves or even more realistic versions of themselves, but just more helpful versions of themselves. And especially in times like these, when we really need to amass a whole kind of number of resources that we can really tap into very quickly when we fall into that pit of fear and worry, which is a really realistic place to be right now, by the way.
Yeah. And, when I hear you describe that, I think about, the West Coast, for example, and buildings that are retrofitted to withstand earthquakes, for example, right? So those buildings are able to sway and to adjust with the earthquake, whereas those that aren't are going to crumble, right? And so what I hear you saying is partly that we want to be sort of the building that's been retrofitted to be sort of earthquake proof, quote unquote. Like, yes, you might have a few broken windows and there's some cleanup we have to do, but the larger structure that we are is gonna still be there, and we can clean up the pieces of the other things, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just the one other thing that I wanted to add, and now it's frustrating me that I don't remember the Japanese name for it, but there's a Japanese art of repairing broken bowls. And it's very frustrating that I don't remember the name, because I always use this concept whenever I talk about resilience.
Yeah.
Because it's this idea that a kind of a repaired bowl, or in this case, a repaired human being, is not to be looked at as this thing that was once whole and now it's broken. It's to be looked at as an even more beautiful version of itself, or an even more complex, more even more whole in some ways version. And I really like that image, and I love the image that you gave as well, because it I think it illustrates how important repair is, so that even if something breaks, it's still not hopeless. And that's kind of the positive psychologist in me speaking. But there are ways in which we can repair and then end up kind of an even better version of ourselves because of that repair that we've gone through.
Yes, and actually that regeneration is a natural part of our experience, right? It's a constant thing that's happening. And what happens is during crisis or trauma, it becomes more acute. But every day we are becoming a different person. We're repairing in different ways. So, wow, this is so beautiful, such a beautiful conversation. But I want to tie this to two topics. One, let's start with this conference initiative. I'm not sure what you would call it, but Humanitech. I'm just going to throw it to you. So tell us about Humanitech, what your intention is, and then I want to circle back and figure out what you've learned from what you've done.
Sure. So Humanitech was meant to be an in-person conference. that was how it was visualized to begin with. I'm part of a collective called the Digital Wellness Collective. Yes. That really aims to educate people, to educate the public about what digital wellness is, what are kind of better and worse ways of designing technology, of implementing technology, of interacting with technology, and kind of consuming digital content. And so a few of my fellow members and I wanted to, New York-based members, wanted to have this conference in New York. Of course, COVID happened, and we realized that we weren't really able to do that. And so, like so many other people and organizations, we decided to pivot this and to make it available online. And the kind of the basic, the foundational idea with that was really to have a conversation around digital wellness and about technology design, implementation, its impact on humanity. And not only that, but to really kind of expand that conversation and to really diversify it, and to diversify it in a lot of different ways, to diversify it in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of profession as well, because I think we're all kind of aware of the fact that these conversations around technology tend to kind of be limited to a very small population or a small component of the population. You know, we're mostly hearing about tech from the people who are creating the tech, from kind of data scientists, software engineers, you know, startup founders, and so on, ones that tend to belong to a particular demographic. Yeah. And for me, partly due, I think, to my kind of very multicultural, multinational, global upbringing, I feel a lot of discomfort where there's a lack of diversity. And so my organizers and I really wanted to come together and really kind of blow open that conversation and invite people with very different backgrounds, and people who maybe typically wouldn't be asked some of these questions around, what do you think about technology? What kinds of technology do you think are beneficial to humanity? What kinds do you think are not so great? And so we invited poets, and we invited neuroscientists, and we invited architects, and we invited psychotherapists, and we invited representatives of some of the biggest organizations today that are addressing some of these questions. So we had someone from Common Sense Media, we had someone from the Center for Humane Tech, from the Digital Wellness Collective, from the Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood, and we just really wanted to bring these very, very diverse individuals together. We had someone joining us from Nigeria. We had people from different parts of the U.S. We had viewers from New Zealand and viewers from South Africa. We just really wanted to expand this conversation and diversify it, and get lots of different people to give us their input based on their many different backgrounds. And so I think maybe that my first takeaway was, first of all, that it's possible to do that. I think a lot of the times especially in the US, but I think in much of the world, we talk about diversity a lot of the time as though it's this really difficult thing to do, to accomplish. And I'm not saying it's the easiest thing to do in all different kind of settings, but what our experience was that once we set the intention, we did it. It really wasn't that difficult to find people who could talk about this topic, and who kind of were a good match for what we were looking for. So that was maybe my first takeaway, is the fact that it's actually really not that difficult to diversify. It's very easy to bring different people together, as long as that's really what your intention is and what you aim to do. I think my second takeaway is that the conversation is a very complex one. It's very complicated. It's not as simple as saying technology is good or technology is bad, or here we have a solution. This is what we're going to do. It's not as simple as that, because it's infiltrated so many layers of our society, and it touches so many different aspects of our lives. And then once you go into kind of how the technology is designed as well, and the people who are designing it, what their goals are, oftentimes we use it on autopilot, and that makes it that much more difficult to really be, to use it in a mindful kind of way, to kind of be a mindful tech user or consumer. So it's a complex question, and it requires, I think, a lot of conversation and constant conversation. We have to constantly be talking about tech and the form that it's in, and how we want to design it, and what aspects of it kind of we're happy with, and what aspects we're not happy with. And then maybe kind of my third takeaway is that a lot of people have really great opinions on this topic, which again kind of leads me back, I guess, to my first point. But it's this idea of diversity, and how important diversity is for anything on this planet, but how important it is for this conversation. Because if you ask the same question to an architect, or a 21-year-old recent graduate, or to a poet, or to a data scientist, you're going to find that they'll all give you equally interesting responses. And I really feel that we need to speak to as many people as possible in order to just create technology that really is focused on improving life and preserving life. And that's something that I always say: if we really want to create humane technology, we have to hear the voices of people who are more concerned about that humane bit than the technology bit. We know what the technology people want. We know what they're what they're trying to do, what their goals are, and where they're coming from. It's the people who are kind of on the other side of that. So the teachers, the historians, the anthropologists, the politicians, even the art historians, the museum curators, whoever it is. We need to know what they think and feel about this as well, and how technology impacts their life, so that when we think about creating better forms of technology, we can keep their voices in mind. And just one other thing that I would kind of add to that, which is sort of related to Humanitech, but is a little bit more future oriented. I'm currently helping with the creation of the very first responsible technology guide. And I'm doing this together with David Ryan Polgar, who's a tech ethicist, who was one of our speakers at Humanitech, and who's really doing incredible work to really actually try and create change. One of the problems we have is that we're constantly kind of trying to catch up to technology. We're constantly lagging behind. The technology is created, it goes out there, and then we go, oh no, look at all these things that now we need to fix, and we need to repair, and we need to pull back and modify things before we pull it out. I think we need to find ways of getting ahead of it, getting in front of it. And that's one of the things that this guide, which is coming out on September 15th, is going to try to do. There's going to be a lot of information there, especially geared towards kind of the younger generation, so that if you're, say, a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old, probably using technology like most kids that age are, this guide will give you ideas in terms of kind of what you can be when you grow up, in terms of creating technology that is going to be more humane, and that's going to be created in a responsible kind of a way, where it's really going to keep in mind some of these really important elements that are often not thought of, such as, does this support mental health? Does this preserve child development, or does it disrupt it? What does this do for our relationships? What does this do for communication? So that's kind of another project that I very much feel is related to what we try to do with Humanitech as well, which is to really expand that conversation and to really get different people's opinions on this. Because I don't think, one thing that I don't want when it comes to digital wellness is, and I think it is considered to be that a little bit right now, which is almost kind of like an elitist problem. It's almost this problem that only a certain kind of layer of our society should be worried about, and nobody else can either kind of afford to think about that, or maybe they feel like it's not even their place to really give their opinion about that. And I really want to kind of to just shatter that concept. Every single person on this planet needs to be asked about what they like and dislike about technology, and what role they want technology to play in their life.
So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And so I'm excited to see I guess once it's released, the responsible technology guide that you mentioned. I'm excited about that. I want to dive deeper into something before we turn to parenting specifically in the current environment. I want to turn to maybe dive a little bit deeper into what you mentioned about mindful use of technology. So what's the connection between that and the work that you do as a psychologist? And maybe by way of introduction to that, can you describe what you mean when you say digital wellness?
Sure, sure. So digital wellness, kind of for me, as I conceptualize it, is using technology in such a way that it really preserves and respects your own mental health and well-being, and your own emotional well-being, and the kind of mental, psychological, emotional well-being of other people as well. So it's a two-way street. Oftentimes we talk about how are we consuming technology. So what platforms are we on? What social media are we on? What information we're kind of taking in? But I think of it as both. It's what I'm taking in and how that impacts me, but it's also about what I'm putting out there and how that is impacting other people, or how both kind of hardware and software wise. How would it impact you if I took my phone and just started doing this in the middle of our conversation? So it's really that self-awareness and awareness of the other as well. So how the tech is impacting us and how we're impacting other people through our use of that tech. So that's the kind of the digital wellness piece in terms of how I think about it and how I conceptualize it. Given that it just kind of by the nature of that definition, it asks for awareness. I think mindfulness is just a kind of natural part of it. And to me,
what is mindfulness? Yeah.
So when I talk about mindfulness, to me, I tend to conceptualize it in kind of very simple terms. I'm not a mindfulness teacher. I'm not a mindfulness instructor, but I use the concepts of it in my work. So to me, mindfulness means awareness, kind of in its simplest form. It's being in the moment, obviously, and it's being aware of what is going on. It's being aware of what am I doing, what am I thinking, what am I feeling. And then, if other people around me, or if other people are around me, either in kind of the real physical world or the virtual world, what's going on for them as well, and how is my behavior impacting them? So that's what I mean when I say mindful technology, whether it's technology use, so technology consumption, technology creation, technology implementation, whether we're talking about us as individuals, whether we're talking about how technology is used in groups. So whether it's a classroom or it's, a corporate setting, or it's out on the street or at a restaurant, wherever it is, it's really having that awareness about what are we doing with this technology, and how is it impacting us? How is it changing us? Because it is definitely doing that, as all forms of technology have done throughout history. And the reason why I find it so important to focus on this is because of something I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is that a lot of the times we do tend to switch to autopilot when we're using our technology. First of all, because it's become so just so kind of, it's just inserted itself into every portion of our life. We use it for pretty much everything that we do. There's so much of it. There's so many different types of, again, hardware and software that you can use. And it's become so important in our lives that oftentimes we just kind of switch off and just use it without really realizing what we're doing and how we're doing it, which is, by the way, a completely natural process for the brain. The brain uses a lot of energy. It's our most kind of expensive organ when it comes to how much energy from the body it consumes. So anything that the brain can streamline, it will do that, which is why it's so easy for us to form habits, but then it's incredibly difficult for us to kind of to shed them. Anytime we repeat anything, a couple of times, the brain goes, all right, you've done it again, which means it must be really important. So I'm just going to kind of keep doing it. Don't worry about it anymore. So, the conscious part of the brain can just kind of go to sleep for a little bit. And it's kind of this automation. So that's why I find that mindfulness component to be really important. And it's something that I work on in different ways with people. So I work with people individually. I work with both children and adults. And then I speak to groups a lot as well, doing workshops and trainings on a lot of these different topics. So whether it's groups of teachers or parents, school administrators, people in professionals in the corporate setting, whether it's at conferences or through conversations like this as well. I find this topic to be incredibly important. I don't think in today's world we can talk about things like mental health or well-being or anything really that happens on a daily basis without taking into consideration the role that technology plays in all of our lives. And so that's where that kind of mindful use of technology is really important in my work.
So you mentioned, and part of your thoughts there, how we go on autopilot and how it's so easy to form habits. And I describe part of this challenge that we face, both related to technology, but just more broadly in terms of how we live as part of the human experience, as something called intention deficit disorder, where we rely on in the case of technology, for example, we rely on our inboxes or our social media feeds to tell us what we're supposed to be doing, how we're supposed to be feeling, right? Just to sort of fill us in. And the danger in that is that if you haven't set a clear intention for yourself about what you would like to see and set your own boundaries and then modified your consumption of technology to match that, that you could be moving through life essentially as an automaton in response to external stimuli. So what's, as a psychologist and as the work that you do with both parents and with adults, can you give us a practical tip to address this particular issue about being on autopilot when it comes to technology?
So it's a few different it's a few different sort of tips, or there are a few different ways of approaching that. And this is one of the most kind of challenging aspects of my work, because people still are different, and they have different habits, they have different likes and dislikes, they use different types of technology for different purposes. So really it will depend on what the issue is. So there's some very kind of general, I guess, kind of guidelines that I think most of us in the digital wellness space tend to give out. So it's things like definitely keeping whether it's phones or tablets out of the bedroom, not going on those devices first thing before you go to bed. Definitely not doing any kind of work related activities, or kind of consuming any content that is going to get you very worked up, whether it's in positive or negative ways. If you spend kind of your last 10 minutes before you fall asleep kind of cracking up, laughing really kind of violently, it's going to be hard for you to fall asleep. So it's being mindful about that, about what am I spending that last kind of half an hour doing, and if there is too much of a kind of attachment to the tech, to keep it outside of the bedroom so that it's not there to just kind of stimulate you, and again get your thoughts to be all over the place and anywhere except right there in that moment in your bed. So that's one of the kind of quickest, not necessarily easiest, but quickest things to do, and people who implement this report really amazing changes. And it just gives them a little bit of that kind of confidence boost as well, to know that they can actually create even more profound changes. I like to generally think about doing this as kind of blueprinting. So what I like to recommend that people do is have a think about kind of where in their homes they use what types of technology and for what purpose. A lot of us are having to work from home right now. If we weren't doing it before, we're doing it now. And so thinking about, okay, what are the types of tech that I actually need to use for my work? If I'm fine with just my laptop and keeping a few tabs open, then let's keep it at just that. So if you also have a phone and you have a tablet, just kind of keep them out of the way, keep them somewhere where you can't see them, because the out of sight, out of mind approach definitely does work, and it does help with that. If you do need to use, 2 devices for your job, that's perfectly fine. It's really not about the numbers. The numbers are totally irrelevant. It's really about where is your attention going and where is your focus going. So one example of something that you definitely don't want to do is, have your Facebook tab open. Or another form of social media with all the notifications and bells and whistles switched on, because that will definitely splinter your attention, and it will just break up your focus in really unhelpful ways. And something that would have taken you maybe half an hour to do will end up taking you 5 hours to do. So it's a little kind of, we call them digital hygiene as well. Little things like that we can do to try as much as we can to basically kind of monotask, right? We all wear multitasking almost as like a badge of honor, but there's so much research in neuroscience that tells us that your brain can't actually do that. There seems to be a segment of the population that can handle multitasking pretty well, and they almost thrive on it. But for the most part, all we're doing is really stopping one thing and starting another, and stopping one thing and starting another. And again, it costs our brain a lot of energy. So as much as you can narrow down your tech use to really one device one tab, one app, one platform at a time, the better it will be. You won't always manage to do it, but as much as you can do it, really, really try and do that and kind of set that intention to see how you can do that when it comes to your work, when it comes to your kind of social life as well. So whatever platform you're using at this point in order to communicate with people as well, kind of try to narrow that down as much as possible. And then also I like to kind of encourage people to think about where to keep their tech physically. So what physical spaces do you want to kind of limit it to? So one of the limits that I place on myself is to really only use my smartphone when I'm at the dining table, which is now / my work space as well. So that's the only place that I will keep it. And in order to use the phone, I need to, if I'm somewhere else in the apartment, I need to come up and I need to come here and I need to look at it. And what that does really is create that bit of friction. That's one of the reasons why we go on autopilot when we use our tech. There's no friction in the way that these devices are designed, whether it's actually physically, and the way they look, the way they feel in our hands, and of course the way all the kind of the user interfaces and the way the design is created. It's meant to be seamless. It's meant to integrate, all these kind of catchphrases that are used by designers and data scientists. So it's effortful, but it's down to us to find ways to create a little bit of that friction. And another way I like to phrase that is kind of fencing or creating borders around our tech use. And so do it in that physical space. So, set rules for yourself in terms of where I use these different devices. Do that in terms of, when do I use them? So what are the times of the day during which I will use them? What are the times of the day during which I will stop? And then, of course, it gets a little bit trickier once you actually dive into that screen and you talk about what are the types of platforms and apps that I will use. But the more that we can really minimize them, and there's a huge kind of digital minimalism movement as well, the easier it will be, because for the simple reason that what it's going to do is it's going to save your brain a whole lot of energy, and it's going to reduce kind of that splintering of your focus and your attention and your intention, as you mentioned before.
So simple, practical, be mindful of when, where, and how you're using your technology. That's the starting point, just as a blanket. We recognize that there are nuances depending on particular challenges people might be facing, but just as a general guideline, thinking about when, where, and how is a good starting place for folks. So I do want to talk about parenting, but you mentioned something about multitasking that I want to maybe just very briefly touch on, because I'm very much in alignment with the way that you described it. Mm-hmm. However, there is another, I should say, school of thought on this, which is that, well, that's absurd. Like, what do you mean we can't do multiple things simultaneously? And what do you mean that our attention is being fractured where we're not able to be productive? Like, I can listen to a podcast and mop the floor. I can, I can listen to music while I am, putting up the groceries. So what can you maybe break down what you mean when you talk about the detrimental impact of multitasking, and what you mean when you're advocating for us to do more monotasking?
Sure. So this is, again, where those kind of individual differences will come in as well. And like I said, not everyone is the same. So some people will be able to do a bunch of different things at the same time, and they'll be able to do them quite well, and they can pull it off. For the most part, when I'm talking about multitasking, I'm not really talking about I'll call them passive activities, such as listening to music, which doesn't require a whole lot of effort, right? That's just kind of, it's kind of an input of kind of information, of the memories that are going to be triggered, the emotions that are going to be triggered, with that music. So an example is I can definitely exercise and listen to music. But for example, I was never the person who could study and listen to music. That was absolutely impossible for me to do, especially if it was music with lyrics, because my attention would go on listening to these words and I'm trying to write my paper. And there's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to do this. So it's a question of what are the tasks that you're engaging in? Do you have are you filing your taxes and you have a deadline that you have to meet, and your child's school has asked you to create a list of, supplies that they need, and there's a fourth thing as well, all kind of equally demanding. Yes. Those are the situations in which it can be very difficult if not impossible a lot of the time, to do all four equally well, and kind of to do them in the shortest period of time that you want to do them. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about multitasking. I'm talking about tasks that are really highly demanding, that really require our cognitive skills. Not so much activities such as, say, working out, which sometimes can require a lot of focus and attention and kind of willpower, but it doesn't require it in the same way as, for example, filing your taxes does, especially in this country, in the United States, or listening to, which I've come to find, or listening to music, which is, like I said, is a little bit more, it's a little bit more kind of passive, or even watching a movie, which is, it can definitely be a kind of passive experience. But again, for example, if you're watching a movie that you're highly engaged in and you're very interested in it, and you're trying to do something like, say, file your taxes, it will probably be a challenge. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it will be a challenge for you to do that, because again, you're trying to pay attention to two things at the same time. One, you're probably not very interested in, which is the taxes, but they're highly demanding and require a lot of kind of detail-oriented work. And then on the other hand, there's this movie which you actually like and you're interested in, and you want to know what the characters said. And again, it's probably triggering emotions for you, it's triggering memories and so on. So that's what I mean when I talk about multitasking. Again, like I said, we know there are differences, there are gender differences as well. So there are all these memes and these kind of, cartoon drawings of women doing 50 different things at the same time. And the man's, I don't know, standing in front of the fridge trying to find the cheese, and it's right in front of him and he can't see it. Some of those jokes that are made around it. There's some evidence, there seems to be some evidence that women are a little bit better at multitasking and holding all of these different kind of thoughts and tasks in their brains at the same time. But kind of generally, when you're talking about engaging in a lot of effortful tasks, it's very difficult to do. And the more that you can kind of cut that down, the better.
Yeah, I love the way you described it. I use the language high-level tasks. So if you're doing multiple high-level tasks simultaneously, that is where you begin to run into issues for most people. So I appreciate you sharing that. So let's sort of switch gears and spend the remainder of the time talking about parenting. And let's start with, what would you say are the top two issues that parents are encountering in the current environment, where parents are probably working from home, they're probably also simultaneously homeschooling, they have concerns about the amount of screen time that their children are engaged in? What are you seeing from your interaction with clients are the top two issues folks are facing right now?
So some of the ones that you've just named are definitely it. Those are the biggest kind of concerns right now. And then, of course, worries around health, their health and well-being. On the one hand, there's a huge amount of worry. There's a general worry and a lot of kind of questions that pop up are questions of the type, will I be able to do this, for one, and am I doing this right? I mean, those are probably the two main questions that parents are asking themselves at one point, partly because we don't know how long this is going to last, and kind of from one day to the next, we don't know what's going to happen. You and I were talking earlier about schools opening up again in New York City, in New York State. It's kind of a moving target. So it's very hard to get a hold of, okay, what are the next few weeks going to look like? What are the next few months going to look like? So there's a huge amount of uncertainty when it comes to that. And then there's a huge amount of uncertainty around, am I doing the right thing? Am I making the right decisions? Am I right to continue working full time? Should I cut that down a little bit, or should I be the only one working and my partner maybe doesn't, so that they can spend time with the kids? Am I making the right decision in sending my kid back to school, say full time, or should I do part time, or should I do homeschooling, or should I move out of the city, which a lot of people have been doing in New York City in particular, or should I leave the country? So there are a lot of questions around, how long will this go on for, and am I doing this right? So a lot of worry, a lot of insecurity, really, around pretty much every single decision that parents are having to make right now. So I think that's one of the biggest ones, if not actually the biggest kind of category, I would say, is that level of uncertainty. And then when you kind of filter down a little bit, you do see some of these questions around their own, but mostly their children's well-being and their children's behavior. And of course, a lot of that is impacted by technology. And so there are a lot of questions around how is this level of attachment to technology and this amount of consumption of technology, yes, impacting them right now, but kind of in the long run, what is this going to mean a few months down the line, or in 6 months, or in a year? When the kind of the pandemic and the lockdown first started, I was seeing in a few different kind of magazines, newspapers, people talking about, oh, let's just kind of throw out any concerns around tech use out of the window. We have much more important things that we need to think about. And I do agree that there are more important things. Obviously, health is absolutely number one. Job security and security is another really, really huge one. But because technology has become our lifeline at this point and has become the lifeline for our kids, we really can't afford to not be thinking about that. One way or another. We have to at least ask questions around that and observe how they're interacting with their technology, whether it's for school, whether it's for socializing purposes, whatever it might be, for entertainment, whatever it is, and just ask some questions around that. I'm not a no tech, no screens, tech free type of approach for parents who choose that for their families. I totally support them, but I'm not necessarily someone who's going to advocate for absolutely no tech being present anywhere. I was born in the 80s. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I watched a ton of television. I watched TV shows, I watched cartoons, I watched movies, and lots of different things. I had Nintendo for a certain amount of time. So it would be ridiculous and hypocritical for me to encourage parents to completely remove tech from their kids' lives. But what I do advocate for is asking questions and not just kind of letting things just kind of play out and just kind of happen the way that they're kind of naturally happening, because a lot of parents are kind of reporting that their kids are spending kind of more time isolated in their rooms with their tech, sometimes until all sorts of hours in the early morning. And some of that is understandable, obviously, because of what's going on. Again, our generation, we don't know how we would have kind of behaved under these circumstances, how this would have played out for us. But and so there needs to be a lot of compassion when it comes to that, absolutely. But again, there need to be conversations around how are you using your tech, and what are you spending your time doing, and what are your friends doing right now, and how do you feel about the fact that you went to bed at 5 a.m. this morning because, say, you were gaming for 5 hours, or whatever it happens to be. But really to have that conversation around that, to show them a lot of compassion and to show them a lot of understanding for what they're going through, but then to also remind them that this will end at some point, just simply because it has to pass, right? It's the impermanence of it all. What are the ways in which we want to look back and look at this period, first of all? And second of all, what are some of the habits that we want to take with us into kind of the post-COVID world, whatever that's going to look like? I read an article, I think yesterday, in the New York Times. It was an opinion piece written by a teenager. And the title was something like, "My dad switched off the internet one day," or something like that. I would definitely encourage viewers, especially those who have teenage kids, to read that article. And this young girl from Bristol in England writes about how her dad switched off the internet one day. And not only that, he took the modem with him to work. And so there's absolutely no way of bringing the internet, bringing internet access back into their home. And, on the one hand, she says that, ultimately I was kind of grateful that he did that, because I noticed the change in me once once the tech wasn't the first and only option that was there. I started reading more. I started making more of an effort to go outside and see if I could spend some kind of socially distant time with my friends. My mom was helping me learn how to cook things. I was doing all of these different things. And even once dad kind of brought the internet back in, she said, I didn't actually immediately rush to my phone, which I expected I would do, but I actually didn't. I was kind of okay about it. And I said, it's okay, I'll check it later. But the other thing she said was she really didn't appreciate the way in which he did that, and the fact that he didn't even speak to her and her brothers beforehand to try and understand why they were spending so much time alone in their rooms on their tech. So I think it's a two-part approach for parents who want to approach this whole topic of digital wellness with their kids. I think that observation needs to be step one. That conversation is step two. And then step three is really trying to problem solve, and again, to engage in that bordering and that fencing and that blueprinting, but always together with the kids, especially if you have teenagers, because as you know, you can't kind of force them to do anything, really. I mean, you can, but then they'll try and get back at you in one way or another, at some point down the line. It has to be a conversation that includes a lot of respect for their kind of increasing need for independence, for taking on more responsibility, and so on. And it really has to be a kind of mutually respectful conversation where they understand the fact that you want what's best for them, and you want to make sure that they're kind of staying healthy throughout all of this, but where they also understand that we need to put a start and a finish to tech use. That's one of the biggest issues that we have when you think about the way tech is designed. So the infinite scroll, for example, one of the things I always encourage parents to talk to their kids about, especially once they get to that age where they start using social media themselves, is how do you know where, say, Instagram ends? Where there is no point. There's no little sign that says, okay, now that's done. That's it. There's no more content. There's no more Instagram stories. There's nothing else that you can see here. We have to decide that on our own. And so I think that's one of the reasons why those conversations with kids are really, really important, so that we can teach them through those conversations how they can identify some of the problems with tech, but then also how they can figure out some of the ways in which they can resolve these issues.
So that's really powerful. And so what I hear you saying in all of that is to really partner with your children to have a conversation, to help, collectively come to a realization about what the issue is, and then to work together to figure out what the appropriate solutions are, setting boundaries about when, where, and how. And to your last point about really making sure your children understand that you have to be the start and the end point, because the technology will go on infinitely, as you mentioned with the infinite scroll. So I think that's beautiful. And so in the last few moments that we have left, I want to just do some rapid fire just scenarios with you and get your thoughts on this.
Sure.
For parents. And just for the sake of this the next few scenarios, let's just assume that this is the case where parents are working from home. They're also homeschooling their kids. They don't have the option of moving somewhere else or outsourcing the homeschooling component. So let's just start with what's happening in the news right now. So we have the social unrest, particularly Black Lives Matter in the US. We have the presidential election that we're in the midst of. And then we also have what's happening with COVID, right? The uncertainty with COVID. So if kids are on social media, they're connecting with friends, we can assume that they're being inundated with information about these particular topics. What do you recommend to parents for addressing and helping their children to process the elephant in the room when it comes to these issues?
Yeah. So the first thing is to make sure that it's not an elephant, that it's, or if it is one, that you come up to it and you pet it and you kind of befriend it, so that it's not this kind of very oversized, scary kind of topic that we know is there and it's real, and yet we're kind of working our way around it and not talking about it. The first thing is depending on the child's age, to make sure that they engage with digital content in an age appropriate way, so that if, say, they're 8 or 9, they don't have their own Instagram account with kind of completely free reign, or that they have completely free reign access to Facebook or really to any virtual platform where you can't really control what they have access to. I think in today's times, you can be very sure that your children will probably stumble upon inappropriate content, kind of age inappropriate content at some point, which makes this all the more important of a topic to really talk to them about. It can be something like a daily, a kind of daily activation or a daily conversation that you engage with them, whether it's during mealtime or if you have moments throughout the day when you all kind of connect together as a family in a kind of analog way, in a real life way, where you're all kind of physically present together to talk about maybe, did you hear the news about, I don't know, the latest COVID cases in New York, or did you see that thing about the fires in California, or did you see that story around immigrants trying to get into the UK, or whatever, again, in age appropriate ways, so more so maybe with teenagers than with younger kids, but really bring these topics up as something that we discuss this as a family. These are things that we talk about, and the reason why we talk about them is, first of all, because we want to be aware, and we kind of want to be global citizens in that sense. So we want to know what's going on in the world, but we also want to kind of come together so that we can try and make sense of it together, and so that the kids can really talk about their own views and their own thoughts on this, whether it's climate change or any the election, whatever it happens to be, so that they can talk about it. Because one thing you can be sure of is that they're thinking about it. They're definitely thinking about it, and I've seen this when I've gone into classrooms where with fifth graders, and this was in 2016, where I was doing several workshops at public schools in New York City, and I had fifth graders who had very strong feelings about the election at that point. And these are fifth graders. You don't assume that they think about who the candidates are and the votes and things like that, but they do. They're aware of it, and their little brains are working overtime to try and make sense of this really crazy world that we're living in. So these kind of meeting points within the family, these conversations are really there to, again, allow them to address these things that are going on in their minds, to really kind of verbalize their thoughts, and to also make them feel like nothing is too scary for me to bring it up with mom and dad, or whoever the guardian is. Nothing is off limits, because one of the worst things that we can do for kids is have them feel that that there are topics that are too scary to talk about, or they're too dangerous to talk about, or they're too upsetting to talk about. Whatever it is, they need to get that message that whatever it is, we can talk about it together. And we may not be able to solve it, we may not be able to resolve all the issues around the presidential election or the civil unrest, or whatever is happening, but we can talk about it, and you can let me know what's going on. With this is kind of more with teenagers, but with younger kids, again, if they're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, they're again bound to stumble on some of these topics. Even if they're not using social media, they might hear it from their friends, and these types of things travel fast with young kids as well, because they find it kind of all the more enticing to talk about these kind of big people problems. But it's just asking them questions around what were some upsetting things that you may have come across today, or were there any kind of heavy topics that you guys discussed in history class or geography or whatever it is, what did you learn today that troubled you a little bit, or what is it that you found in the news over the past couple of days that was really distressing to you. So really to try and share as much as possible. Like I said, I was born in the early 80s, and I'm Eastern European, but I grew up in the Middle East. And both of the countries that I lived in experienced civil war. Luckily, not while I was there. For a little bit, that was the case too. But I grew up with this awareness of war and killings and political unrest and all these different things. But because at that point, and I'm not saying my childhood was better than kids today, but because we didn't have these mobile devices that we could kind of take away with us, into our rooms, all of the news watching happened kind of in the community of my family. We were all taking in the news together, and then we all shared with each other the horror of it, or the fear we felt, or the trepidation, whatever it was. So it really was a joint experience. We shared in the horrors and the fears that we experienced and that we saw out in the world. So because our devices are built the way they are right now, and we can do a lot of this kind of consumption of tech alone, I think it's really important to try and bring families together as much as possible right now, and to just encourage them to share things as much as possible.
Yes, so thank you for that. And so I hear you saying in that particular point, just make sure that you're having the conversation and not having it be the elephant in the room. So in the last few seconds that we do have left, this has been a rich conversation, and there's so much more we could say and talk about and dive
Absolutely.
deeper on.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you being here today. And I just want to, in the last few seconds that we have left, if you could tell people really quickly, what's the best way to reach you to find out more about you and to work with you?
Sure, sure. So the easiest way is probably to just go to my website, which is www.topcoaching.com. So that's TEOP coaching.com, where people will be able to find information about my background, about some of the work that I'm doing right now. Like I said, the Responsible Tech Guide is one of the projects that I'm participating in right now. I have a parenting workshop, a digital wellness parenting workshop that I'll be hosting later on in September. So if we have any parents of tweens watching us, please feel free to contact me to find out more about that. And then people will be able to find me on social media as well. So I tend to be most active on Twitter and LinkedIn. Instagram, I joined very recently, and the jury's still out on that one. I'm not sure how much I like Instagram, but I'm there for now. So people will definitely be able to find me in those places as well. And yeah, I encourage everyone to just to feel free and get in touch if they have any questions about my work, about the digital wellness space, if they would like any resources. If they would like me to connect them with people who are in this space so they can learn more, I'm really open to connecting with people and to just generally kind of help raise awareness around all of these topics that we talked about.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to future conversations. And yeah, so thank you for just taking the time to share with us. For the folks that are listening to this, watching this, I want to thank you for tuning in for another conversation on Mindful Techie Tuesday. And I invite you to love, to like, to share, to comment in the comments, tag someone who could benefit from this. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Miko.
Thank you.